turn on. There we go. So thank you and welcome to this Mass Save residential new construction overview of the Passive House incentive path with some feasibility case studies and a discussion with an expert panel. I would like to ask our expert panel to introduce themselves briefly. We have experts from Linnean Solutions, offering sustainability services and Passive House, and New Ecology, offering sustainability and Passive House services, among other things. Ian, could I ask you to kick it off?
Sure. Yeah, this is Ian Johnson with Linnean Solutions. I'm a senior director for them and focus on Passive House certifications, LEED certification, as well as Living Building Challenge projects. We're located in Cambridge and happy to be here.
Thanks, Ian. And Lauren.
Hey everyone, I'm Lauren Bauman. I'm Vice President at New Ecology. So New Ecology is a Boston-based nonprofit with a mission to promote sustainable development in low-income communities. So we do a lot of affordable multifamily housing work and quite a few Passive House, LEED type projects, really focusing on high-performance buildings.
Ashley.
Hi, I'm Ashley. I'm a senior project manager with New Ecology. I do a lot of LEED certifications and Energy Star certifications, and I'm a CPHC as well.
Thanks. And from ICF, representing Mass Save, we have me and Kristen Simmons. Kristen, would you?
Sure. Hi, Kristen Simmons. I am the manager of the Mass Save Residential New Construction High-Rise and Passive House paths. I'm also a licensed architect. I took my first certified Passive House consultant training in 2010 and co-founder of Passive House Massachusetts. So thrilled at where we're at in every way right now.
And I am Luke McNeely, also registered architect and sustainability guy. I had the pleasure of working with New Ecology for a while, and I'm now at ICF assisting with the Mass Save program with a focus on Passive House. And so with that, we have a couple of slides to just kind of go through and kick things off. This presentation will be a general overview of the Mass Save incentives and the Passive House process, with the goal that we would like to make sure that developers and architects and teams in general know what to expect when doing their Passive House feasibility study and how to interpret the results. And ultimately, we hope you'll get a sense of what are some of the benefits and challenges. Just a bit of background. This is all supported by the Massachusetts Utilities Program Administrators. And so Mass Save is a group project by all of them. And you can find out more from masssave.com. So, general overview. We have three paths. ICF is the consultant to the program administrators, providing a one-stop shop for them on the especially renovations and additions, low-rise new construction, and the multifamily high-rise project types. All of the incentives are performance-based with a few exceptions. And participation is basically aligned with and oriented to exceed the base code and stretch energy codes. As everybody here may be aware, one of the nice new offerings is Passive House training. And so all webinars are now online and no cost. Also, no cost workshops. So longer sessions with more in-depth information, formerly hands-on, now kind of interactive and aiming to get back to the hands-on. As Erin just mentioned, also 50% of the accreditation cost for certification, professional certifications with THEIS and PHI are provided through this. So, Kristen, I am going to hand it off to you to go over the enhanced incentives.
Great. Let me get my video going. And yeah, so PassFast Massachusetts asked me to put together some slides showing what's going on in Massachusetts. So yeah, right here, perfect. So there's been a big impact, and I would have loved to have been a little bit more subtle and had some cool, dynamic graphics. But what does this graph tell us? So orange are the number of units per year. Blue is the number of buildings. So you can see that Massachusetts had its first multifamily passive house in 2018. That's really all I'm looking at right here. That was the Distillery, which a lot of us know about. And then there were none. So happily, we do have our first 2 projects completing this year in the Mass Save program. And then we continue on with, I believe, 15 in 2021, potentially 23 in 2022, etc. So this is, I think, a pretty exciting graph. Luke, can you go on to the next one? And this is looking at really the same information annually and cumulatively. So we're beginning to develop our hockey stick here. This is some pretty incredible growth. At the end of 2023, fingers crossed, we'll be at over 4,000 units. Given the realities of the world, I can imagine that a lot of these projects potentially could be delayed. So they might not all, book or complete in the year that we see here. And I thought the family was going to be the problem. I didn't think the animal. So I thought everything was in control. But still, even if projects get delayed, even if some of these projects decide ultimately not to pursue Passive House in the end, this is pretty phenomenal. And just to kind of put things in perspective, we actually rolled out this multifamily program for Mass Save, the beginning of a multifamily program in 2013. So this program itself is not very old. And so to be able to roll out incentives for Passive House multifamily last year and to be able to have such an impact so quickly is really astounding. I think Passive House Massachusetts takes a lot of credit for it. Certainly our Mass Save sponsors do too. They took the charge and they ran with it. Luke, if you can go on to the next slide, please. Thanks. Okay, so what does this mean? This means over 4.7 million gross square feet by the end of 2023, ideally, over 4,000 units and more, because I know there are more projects out there. These projects are throughout the Commonwealth, from the almost practically the tip of Cape Cod to the far reaches of Western Mass. The projects are both market rate and affordable. I think that I can almost safely say that about 80%, 90% of low income and affordable developers are now looking in, trying out Passive House. We also have a lot of market rate. I would say the majority of the units are market rate that we're forecasting right now. And this picture down at the bottom is Brewster, project currently in design, affordable Passive House or low income Passive House being developed by POA out in Brewster, Massachusetts. Okay, Luke, if you can go on. So what's the average project? So the average project is 73 units and 85,000 gross square feet. Median's a little bit smaller. We have a lot of smaller projects. So median's 52 units and 65,000 square feet. Probably pretty good size. And this actually matches up well with the average project we see in the Mass Save program. All construction types are represented: steel frame, podium, wood frame. What we're seeing is everything is being done, looked at for Passive House. There's no special typology. There's no special developer type. It is all projects. And let me see, do I have one more slide here, Luke? I don't remember. That might be my last slide.
That is the last slide.
That is the last slide. So that's a good one to end on. I think it's really, really incredible. I can't say enough that it's taken a lot of people a really long time for all this success to happen so suddenly. So thank you out there, everyone. And I will turn it back to Luke now.
Thank you, Kristen. So we're happy to see that there's been some very good participation. Overall, at this point, we're going to dive into the Passive House enhanced incentives, generally speaking, and kind of give an overview of what they are. All of this information is, again, available on the Mass Save website and free to reach out to Mass Save for more direct contact and information. But in general, the incentives cover all multifamily buildings that are 5 units and greater. We are looking to see enrollment in the program in schematic design, where there is plenty of room for understanding the Passive House requirements. Projects can be pursuing the US FIAS certification or PHI, the international certification, but must work with a Passive House professional. So the incentives are broken into 2 basic categories. We have pre-construction incentives, which are focused on design. They include a feasibility study that will cover 100% of feasibility costs up to $5,000. The goal of this is to really allow teams to dive into Passive House, get an understanding of the scope and requirements, and have some flexibility in the design process. Following that, we have energy modeling with a 75% of the modeling costs, or $500 per unit with a maximum of $20,000 for the project to continue the discussion and design development, keeping the energy model up to date and making sure that the project stays on track to be able to achieve the Passive House requirements. Once you've made it through your design process, you have your project documents prepared to meet the Passive House criteria, submitting through FIAS or PHI for pre-certification. Once you receive a formal pre-certification from one of those third-party certifiers, then you will be able to receive a flat $500 per unit at that point. This is also a gateway, and so pre-certification is a requirement to continue down the Passive House incentive path. If the project does not pre-certify, then we will be transitioning back to the standard high-rise path. Once a project has pre-certified, however, there are the post-construction incentives available. The key being certification, which is again a flat incentive of $2,500 per unit. So this is clearly a significant offering and really trying to kickstart the Passive House movement here, and has been, as you've seen from Kristen's data, been doing a pretty good job of moving projects into this path. If once a project has gotten pre-certified and is in this post-construction incentive program, there is also the net performance bonus incentive component, which is based on savings above a baseline model. I'll talk a little bit more about this shortly, but the basic values for the savings calculation is 75 cents per kilowatt hour of electricity energy use saved above baseline, and or $7.50 per therm of energy use savings. This is calculated after subtracting, well, it's calculated based on the design of the building, and then needs to net out the pre-certification and certification incentives. So projects that qualify for this the savings will be calculated, and then the pre-certification and certification incentives will be subtracted from that. Overall, the process is pretty straightforward. In schematic design phase, we do our feasibility study and modeling. If we are able to get to pre-certification, we get the $500 flat incentive. If not, we go down the standard incentive path. Once we've got the pre-certifications, we can move on to certification. If for any reason certification does not continue, the project does not achieve certifications, then the net performance bonus still does play some role. And so a value for a good, highly efficient design can be rewarded with the net performance bonus. If we do get the certification, then the flat certification incentives play in. And there is potential that in addition with an extremely efficient building, net performance bonus may also play in as well. One of our participants who was on this call was asking for a little bit more clarity in the timeline. So I tried to simplify things a little bit. This is also part of our process document. Just clarifying the schedule of things. Again, schematic design, we are going to register the project and perform the feasibility study with an energy charrette. In design development, we may have energy modeling continuing throughout design, ultimately looking at FIAS and PHI pre-certification at the end of the construction documents stage. In construction, we are looking at the early modeling of the project, and so we need to know the energy conserving measures, or ECMs, that have gone into the project. Ultimately, we are looking at construction completion for the Passive House certification, and at following closeout, an incentive payment will be available after we have verified all of the energy conservation measures and whether or not certification has occurred. So I'm going to dive in a little bit deeper now and get into what we are doing for Passive House feasibility, what we are looking for, what is expected of a project team. So the first and foremost, a project cannot participate in any part of the incentive program without register. And so a registration form is available that will highlight whether or not the project is going for Passive House. If you are interested in Passive House, you may feel free to check that box and request more information. Once the project is registered, we do need drawings or a detailed description in order to get a basic picture of what the project entails. And in order to start the Passive House incentive process, a proposal for the feasibility study and or modeling services needs to be put together by a certified Passive House consultant. In that proposal, we are looking for certain services to be provided to our participants. The developers will need to be able to receive, well, forgive me, the slide jumped there. We need to identify which Passive House standard the study is being done under. And then ultimately we'd like to see, and there's a bullet missing here, unfortunately, but information on the envelope, mechanical systems, thermal bridging, and then ultimately a report of the findings and recommendations for how the project can move forward in order to meet the Passive House criteria. See, that might be why. As a culmination of the feasibility effort, an energy charrette is required, and this is to bring the entire team together. This should be done in schematic design or design development early stages. And we are looking to see the engineering team, the developer, ownership team, the architects, and Mass Save make sure that everyone understands what is at stake, what is required, and has the right information to be able to move forward. And so the feasibility study will be presented for specific project-specific path for success, with envelope assemblies, the mechanical systems, and any challenges that are noted with opportunities on how to resolve them. When we have received the feasibility study report, the meeting notes from the energy charrette, and an invoice from the consultant to the developer that identifies the feasibility study effort, we are able to then provide the payment to the developer. The same basic process will apply to the Passive House modeling. Proposal for modeling services. Ultimately, the Passive House models, WFI or PHPP, will be submitted along with backup documentation. So any drawings and submittals that are being recommended for the project, and the modeling invoices. Once again, the incentive payment, as always, goes to the developer. And then we move into the pre-certification stage, once again, looking for an official Passive House Institute US or Passive House Institute notification of the project's pre-certification, at which point we can pay the developer. And again, this is a gateway to the post-construction incentives. So Passive House certification same situation, upon official notification, we are able to make our payments. The net performance bonus, just to clarify, as this is an often misunderstood component, this is a calculation of the project's modeled performance above a baseline that ICF will model. The total savings then is multiplied out by the values I gave earlier to generate the total incentive, gross incentive amount. The net performance bonus is actually then the value after subtracting the pre-certification and or certification incentives from that gross incentive amount. So ICF will be calculating that twice during the project, once at around the pre-certification phase. So after we've received all of the necessary information and are able to model the project accurately, an initial offer of what that net performance bonus could be will be provided. And then once again at final construction completion in order to verify and finalize the value. How does that apply to your project? Well, will it receive it if the project has been pre-certified but does not get the final certification? Yes, net performance bonus is going to be the calculation for the incentive. If the project does get certified, that is still just a maybe. And this really does depend on how well the building performs, if it can meet the savings value beyond what the value of the pre-certification and certification flat incentives add up to. So I'm throwing this in here now because there is a chance that we won't have be able to show this later. But again, you may email at passivehousetrainingmass@icf.com for training information, multifamily high-rise, but multi-FHR@icf.com to register projects or to ask questions about the incentives. And by all means, visit masssave.com to find out as well. And so with that, we are now going to hand things over to Lenaean Solutions. Ian Johnson will take over to discuss one of the project feasibilities that they have been working on. Ian.
Thanks, Luke.
Thank you.
Yeah, yeah, want to go to the, okay, great, thanks. Hi, everyone, I'm Ian Johnson with Lenaean Solutions. This is a project we completed a feasibility study for in Somerville. It's with Eaglebrook Capital and Balance Architects. It's a 4-story building with 26 units, and it's about 23,000 square feet. And it's all residential, so there's no commercial space or anything on the first floor. And it was a great candidate for Passive House just because of its straightforward design. And we were able to kind of move forward with the feasibility study and help the designers and developer kind of decide if they wanted to actually pursue full certification. Can you go to the next slide, please? So, you know, you may be wondering, you know, in order to get incentives, we have to go through the feasibility study. So what's the process for it? So really for this project, we kind of looked at the existing design and schematic design and kind of did a full review of, you know, certain things that might have been potential issues with relation to achieving Passive House certification. And a big part of that is getting this project into an energy model. And so with this project pursuing FIAS Plus 2018, that was a WUFI Plus energy model. And so then that would give us some information and kind of give some data to the designers to figure out what they needed to do in order to bring it up to snuff for to get certified. Next. So here's just kind of the general layout of the building to give you kind of a understanding. It's, you know, kind of a general rectangle with really kind of tight units and minimal common space. So this actually makes that a good candidate for Passive House to not have any kind of extra areas that we need to heat and cool. And there's not a lot of dynamics to the envelope, so that makes it very simple. And so that allows us to kind of just kind of go straight forward with how the envelope will be air sealed down the road. Next. So part of the feasibility study was looking at the design or the details, and these were pretty straightforward, but they're also very early on. So we had a lot of good conversation during the feasibility charrette and in creating kind of our study to discuss with the designers of, you know, how those transitions might look, what details might be important for them to focus on down the road. And so, you know, having this straightforward envelope made it pretty easy. One of the things we looked at were potential thermal bridges in the balconies, and, you know, I'll talk about that a little bit more in a couple slides. Next. So in completing the feasibility study, there's really these kind of big things that popped out for this project. And, you know, looking at the project as a whole, some of those were ensuring adequate space for solar and the HVAC systems on the roof. It's not shown here, but they also possibly want to have some, you know, outdoor patio space on the roof deck for occupants. And so trying to make sure that, you know, they'll have adequate solar and enough room for mechanical systems, as well as, you know, some room to enjoy that space, you know, is early on conversation, which is great to figure out how they might, you know, design that better starting now, knowing how many solar panels they're going to need. We also recommended removing some additional glazing. They kind of had a lot of glazing in the front that lined the common hallways. And so that was actually removed in the design and minimized to just a couple windows in that space to still provide daylight, but not act as kind of a big transfer of heating and cooling through all the glass. We also looked at all the potential for window glazing and reviewed kind of where they were looking, what types of window specs they were looking at. FIAS Plus requires condensation and comfort requirements to be met for all windows. So, you know, you may be looking at a really decent window, and then based on your climate zone, that might actually not meet the requirements, because putting it into that calculator will actually lower the U value a bit. So the window specs had to be kind of improved a little bit for this project. And then, like I said, we're looking at all these balcony connections and discussing that with the architect and making sure that they were, you know, aware that those are potential thermal bridges and how those might look, you know, how the details might look to ensure that those are thermally broken connection points. You can have thermal bridges in your building. It's not advised, but then there's extra modeling that's done to compensate for that, and typically that will, you know, work against you in the energy model. Next. So kind of the steps in this project were to kind of understand, you know, what the thresholds were, where were we kind of at a baseline, and where do we need to get. So the graph kind of shows where we were in red as the baseline, and then where we needed to get in the kind of yellowy orange color there. And then each of those bars represent our FIAS Plus targets. for achieving certification. And those will adjust project to project based on your envelope area and interior square footage. And so for this project, you can see that we definitely need to focus on our heating demand, heating load, and just a little bit on cooling load. So the key to the feasibility study is that once we put all this information together, we were able to kind of give the developers a list of things so that they were able to kind of evaluate the costs of those changes, and then make a decision on whether to keep going with Passive House or not. Next. So this is just a screenshot from the WFOE energy model. It shows similar, it's a similar graph to the previous one. But as you can see, when we first kind of ran the model, we weren't meeting all the thresholds. And so there was kind of a handful of things that we had to improve on. Next. So it might be hard to see, but there are vertical lines on each of those rows there. And so we had to bring each of those down and figure out how to reduce heating demand, heating loads, cooling loads, and source energy. The source energy needs to meet 3840 kilowatts per hour per person per year. And we're about 5,000. So we had a little ways to go. And so what some of the main components that we typically see came up in this project. It was a good feasibility study and case study to kind of explain the process. Next. So what were the main takeaways? And that we've kind of seen, similar takeaways on most projects of this size or a little bigger. And so really, as most of us know, air sealing details and airtight construction are really number one, and focusing on that kind of from day one. Looking at kind of, R30 walls, R55 or R50 roof, and R10 or R20 foundation insulation, depending. Better windows. So we needed to kind of adjust those windows and to meet the condensation and comfort requirements for FEIS Plus. We eliminated any potential thermal bridges in the balconies. And so that kind of gives us a good airtight construction, continuous thermal envelope. And minimized duct lengths actually really improves the HVAC efficiency and has a big impact on the energy model. And often this isn't really taken into consideration in some of the projects we've seen. So like it keeps coming up as a big one and a great way to kind of reduce total energy use of the building. This project needed about 70 solar panels to get us down into that, required 3840 kilowatts per hour per person. The other options for that are, joining community solar program. You can also purchase renewable energy credits, although they're not a one-to-one kind of offset. I think it's only a 0.2 offset for every one REC you buy. So you have to buy quite a bit more, but it's still a cheap option. And contractor education. I think if there's one thing anyone who's worked on a Passive House project knows, it's that, being prepared to find a contractor that's willing to work on a Passive House and to have those conversations early on to help with cost estimates and construction are extremely valuable. I think that's it, Luke. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian. Much appreciated. All right. And if I could now ask Ashley to come on from New Ecology.
Sure. Thanks, Luke. All right. So we're going to talk about a feasibility study that we did in the fall of 2019 for the McElwain Apartments project. If you can go to the next slide, Luke. So McElwain is located in Bridgewater, Massachusetts. This is a very high priority area for affordable and high performance housing. Both owner and developers, Capstone Communities and MPZ Development, were already pushing the envelope in most of their buildings. They were doing LEED for home certification, which we are hoping to also do here. And they really wanted to have a strong application for the February submission for tax credits. So they wanted to complete the feasibility study to inform the charrette, which would then make sure that their design, when they got to that submission in February, was a really strong case for FIUS, and they weren't over-promising. This was their first Passive House certified building, so at the time of the feasibility study, it was very schematic. We didn't have a lot of design details. We had some system preferences, but it was great to be able to use the results of the feasibility study to then inform the design as they moved forward. Next slide. So this is where we ended up with the, starting with the envelope. This was the passing design that was used to meet the FIUS Plus core requirements. So we're using an R50 roof, an R25 exterior wall, R10 slab, and a U.18 window. So these are all typical passive house values, but also not out of the ordinary, not going completely above and beyond, and still doable given the building's design. They did have a preference to use panelized wall systems here. So one of the discussions was between a Hunter wall system and a Zip-R wall system. There were a lot of considerations there, such as shear, weight of cladding, installation details, and some of the intricacies required to achieve an effective air barrier in those materials. Right now, they're moving forward with the Hunter panel, which is going to be an R12.5 on the outside of the building. That might change as we continue to move through design, but that will be the basis of whatever ends up on the building. They also have cellulose in the cavity with an option for open spray foam. And although using foam isn't necessarily our ideal, given the carbon complexities of that material, it was what was available to this team and preferred at the time of design. You can also see the ACH 50 number there. So Passive House generally provides a air tightness value in CFM 50 per square foot. And we like to convert that to ACH, which is air changes per hour. So we find that's a bit more accessible to talk about for a whole building. And for this building, that's 0.48. Next slide. Our HVAC and domestic hot water approach. So the team had a preference for air source heat pumps, primarily because they had a requirement for individual metering of each unit. And this would allow both of the interior and the exterior units to be on the tenant meter and have them pay for their own heating, cooling, and plug loads. We also had 2 rooftop ERVs. We decided to do a whole building ERV system. This was preferred by the MEP designer, just given the layout of the building and the floor space available within the building. And then we also went with central gas-fired boilers with a recirculation loop. There was a lot of discussion about the potential to use an electric domestic hot water option here. Unfortunately, that would have kicked us out of this Mass Save program, but we did want to explore that possibility and see what that would look like for this building. And then we also used the Helioscope program to use the existing roof layout and maximize the number of solar panels that could fit there. And you'll see the total number of solar output that was required for us to get to a passing FIUS study. Next slide. So similar to what Ian showed you, this is the output of the WFI modeling for the FIUS study. Luckily, most of our criteria was met. We were able to meet the heating demand, cooling demand, heating load, cooling load. Next slide. And the key to look at here is this source energy. So Ian mentioned this a little bit in his presentation as well. So the left line on that source energy is showing that 3840 kilowatt hours per person to meet FIAS 2018. However, this project is actually going to pursue FIAS plus core, which raises that requirement to 5,500. It's a little more lenient, but there are some related requirements about how solar can apply. So luckily we do pass the core requirements there. Next slide. So this is what our feasibility study looks, and this is what we give to the team and use to discuss at the charrette. So you can see in the right side, we've got 2 columns there. The first being the reference building. This is where we put in the design information that we were given from the team. And if we don't have design information, we typically use Energy Star defaults or information from previous projects just to get a good baseline of a typical building, a typical high performance building. And then in the column to the far right, you see how we had to upgrade in order to get to pass on all the requirements for that FIAS plus core. The cells that are shown in yellow are any items that we needed to change from our quote unquote typical high performance building to the FIAS core compliant building. So for instance, the R values for both the roof and the wall needed to be upgraded. The window needed to be upgraded to a FIAS window, and the air tightness was significantly decreased to comply with the FIAS core threshold. Next slide. And then these are just all the other information that goes into that model. So we've got lighting, plug loads, typical occupancy of the building, which is used to calculate the related thresholds, appliances, ventilation, mechanical systems, and all of that based on the preferences of the design team and the design narrative at the time already passed within the FIAS core requirements. But we did have to add that solar PV system, which ended up being about 50,000 kilowatts per year. And I think that might be the last slide. Is that correct, Luke?
That is correct. So thank you very much, Ashley. And with that, I would like to ask our presenters to come on video. And we just have a discussion at this point, and then we will open it up for some questions from the audience that Erin will help moderate. So if we can just kind of keep this a little bit loose and as a more casual conversation, the questions that we have been discussing back and forth as we've been going through these this early stage process and getting developers on board and on task. The key question, as Lauren brought up, is what is the value proposition for the owners of even just looking into Passive House? Why is this a good direction? And I think I'm going to throw that to Lauren to start.
Sure. Well, I can speak to it specifically from the affordable housing perspective. So there's been an amazing amount of advocacy and work that's been done by a lot of people who are actually in attendance on this call right now over the last couple of years to really make Passive House an important piece of conversations around affordable housing. And so, you know, we have seen a tremendous number or uptick in interest from affordable housing developers. Some who were sort of like usual suspects and we had been working with for quite a long time to just kind of incrementally improve the performance of their projects. And they were doing some of these very high performance LEED projects or maybe sort of exploring ideas of net zero. But some of whom have kind of come out of the woodwork since there are now points associated with pursuing Passive House for the low-income housing tax credit application. You know, we are seeing more and more communities proliferating zoning bylaws or overlays that are encouraging Passive House as well. And so we're getting developers coming to us early stage in their projects. You know, some of those zoning conversations are happening way ahead of any sort of design even, and saying, hey, you know, this is a pathway I can take in order to comply with some of these new zoning requirements. What does that mean? Like, I don't understand how to even think about this. So can you talk to me about, you know, what it means? And if this is the type of project I do as a baseline, what am I going to have to change? And so I think these feasibility studies are a fantastic opportunity to engage people in that way and really help them understand where their sort of current baseline project approach stands in relationship to this FIA standard, and what's going to have to change just in terms of the numbers, which I think is what you see in a lot of what comes out of the modeling. You know, what does your R value have to go up in terms of your wall or your roof? And then to some of the things that Ian was saying, you know, what are the ancillary conversations that need to happen around, hey, it's not just about, you know, shifting your R value in your spec from 25 to 35. It's about actually being really conscious and cognizant about thermal bridging issues and air infiltration. And what is that going to take? So those are the kinds of conversations that we're having with developers right now. And so I think there's huge value propositions for those two types of developers who are working in communities where this is now a pathway for compliance, and or, you know, are currently doing really high performance affordable housing, and this is the next step for them, or want to be part of this movement and really make sure their projects are competitive.
Lauren. Ian, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I'll just say that, you know, with the Mass Save incentives, we've had clients who never would have considered Passive House. Clients that are just coming along, you know, maybe looking at LEED, they need to meet some requirements for the municipality. And, you know, we explain the feasibility study and how that works and how they can kind of step through the program. And that's been really helpful for us to at least give them an opportunity to, hey, evaluate the building, see how it's doing. The costs are pretty much covered. And then, you know, being that they can step through it and stop at any point, they're not scared to kind of start the process, which I think that's so key in getting passive houses built, is getting past that like fear of, oh, this is new, it's scary, to people who aren't used to it. So it's a great opportunity. And I think it's bringing a lot of new projects that would not necessarily get really any certification except for, you know, the bare minimum.
Excellent. Ashley, I don't want to lock you in on a question, but do you see there's a particular place where the value is being realized? So this is a slight variation on that question, previous question, but is there any particular aspect that you think is really where the value is coming up?
Yeah, I mean, especially doing the feasibility studies before we have the charrette with the team I've found it's become a really useful tool to help inform them and making those design decisions. Whereas before it was a bit of there's too many concepts to hold and too many options to get to a certification. Whereas if we have the results of this feasibility study, we can really hone in and say, okay, can we get to this R value? If we can't do it in the roof, where are we going to change elsewhere? And really inform those decisions.
So maybe back to Ian. What is the big difference? This is kind of a basic question, but what is the difference between Passive House versus code or stretch code?
Yeah, you know, it's certainly paying attention to the specific targets that are laid out for us through the Passive House certification, whether you do FIAS or FI. And so that really, you know, notches up the air tightness for us. And, you know, I think what I've noticed is like, it's really a shift to what everyone focuses on, and focusing on the details to the point where we're looking at it much more specifically than we did before, you know, and paying attention to transition points and working with the contractors and having more of an open conversation early on about, you know, what it's going to take to get there and what's their process for making sure someone's not going around putting holes in the wall that aren't going to be filled So I think it's bringing more conversation to the whole process of development, which is great. And yeah, that's kind of what I've seen.
Lauren, would you add anything like how this compares to stretch code or standard code?
Yeah, I think the response that we're getting from developers, and I think one of the really beautiful things about these feasibility studies is that we're, when you were looking at Ashley's presentation, you'll see there weren't too many boxes that were yellow, right? So I think that's really an important piece of this, is that for developers who are already building pretty good buildings in jurisdictions that require pretty good buildings, it's not a huge jump. And that's sort of the response that we often get to some of these feasibility studies. When we bring the results out and we show people like really what they have to change, they're like, oh, okay, that feels manageable. I can understand what you're talking about in terms of those items and what we might need to shift. And then obviously there are so many things that go into actually getting to a certified passive house project. But I think the design process and the construction process gives us the right time to really focus in on each of those things. And I think the time to focus in on the sort of big picture, non-granular stuff is in this feasibility study, get people to be able to wrap their heads around the concept. And then, as we get them to take the next step into the design process and we start to really flesh out that model with more details, then it gives us more opportunities to really dive into the details around like, okay, what are we really talking about when we talk about these thermal bridging issues and how do we address these complicated details? So I think even just that process gives us the opportunity to kind of bring people along at a pace that feels manageable to them, at least in our experience to this point.
Excellent. So Ashley, I'm going to throw it back to you with any thoughts on what you have been learning on recent projects.
Yeah, so I think the main thing that we've learned is to simplify the geometries of the envelope in particular as much as possible. Unfortunately, if we built everything as a box, it would probably be the easiest way to get there. Maybe not the most aesthetically pleasing though. So we try to balance between, that very simple design and something that will still pass. And particularly in regards to windows, window placement within the wall and shading plays in a lot to the energy modeling, and having that as a consideration from the beginning can help make sure that when we get to the end, we still have a building that will pass all the requirements.
Ian, would you add anything on lessons that you've been learning along the way?
Yeah, I mean, keep it simple. I think a lot of the time we try and do a complex design, have big, mechanical systems, but what we've seen in a couple projects is, really just simplifying it. And, some projects have parameters for occupants to pay their own electric bills and heating. And that sometimes shifts what systems they'll choose, but for the most part, you're still able to keep it, very simple. And seeing, ERV systems with heat pumps or VRF really has been kind of the standard for most of these projects, and fairly inexpensive. So keeping, and even windows, used to be really expensive of an upgrade to get passive house certification. That's not really the case anymore. We have a project using Harvey windows, which are fairly inexpensive, and it's there's great options out there. So
I'm going to ask Lauren to dive in again on any trends that you may have been seeing in terms of things like heating, water.
Yeah. Domestic hot water, that's a big one. I think getting people to pay attention to that really early. I think we've seen lots of variation in terms of the challenge associated with hitting those domestic hot water rise test requirements based on the layout, the initial layout of the units and the placement of kitchens and baths, and as it relates to either recirculation loops or to the domestic hot water system that's in each unit. So getting designers to think like really early about efficiently planning their space as much as possible to minimize the amount of domestic hot water piping, I think is really important. Sometimes it's hard to get into projects early enough to make a big difference from that perspective. But again, trying to do this as early in schematic design and have conversations with the architect early about that, I think is important. One other thing that, you know, we're seeing success around is, you know, a lot of the urban projects have some commercial space on the first floor. And so we see as a default sort of storefront window systems being put in a majority of a lot of those first floor spaces that are going to be either retail or common spaces. And I think we've had a lot of success in having conversations with architects and convincing them that those don't need to be storefront, because it can be very expensive and challenging to get really high performance storefront systems. But if they do this as sort of larger punched windows that are fixed, they still get a lot of the same benefit of the transparency, the connection to the pedestrian streetscape, the daylighting, and they can get pretty high performance windows and they're not as expensive as the really high performance storefront systems. So I think that's something where we try to have conversations with folks early about that as well. You know, I think the only other thing I would put out there is that domestic hot water is still a real challenge in terms of electrification. So we know we all are trying to move in that direction. You know, especially the affordable housing developers are still by and large opting for gas-fired central domestic hot water systems because there's just still a lot of uncertainty around the equipment, the electric equipment, especially the air source heat pump electric equipment. And so I foresee that there'll be a lot of progress in that area in the next couple of years. I'm optimistic about it. But I think at this point, you know, we're still seeing a majority of the projects choosing to pursue certifications, still utilizing gas-fired domestic hot water systems.
That is awesome. I am gonna, that's all I have for my questions, but I would like to just keep it open for a moment more. We are doing pretty well on time. And I just wanted to end this particular discussion session by asking Ian, Ashley, and Lauren if there are any other things that you feel are kind of key elements that a developer should know going in or should ask about as they get started.
I would just,
go ahead.
sorry.
No, go ahead.
I would just say that there are some complexities related to multifamily buildings that weren't necessarily prepared for when FIAS was developed. And so things like trash rooms and central laundry rooms really have to be carefully designed and perhaps even removed from the passive house boundary in some cases. So really making sure that we understand the ventilation requirements for them and where they're located in the building has often become a long discussion.
Yeah, and I was just going to second what Lauren had said about storefronts or, you know, excessive glazing on commercial spaces. You know, a lot of the time we want this aesthetic feel. We want people to be drawn into that first floor retail space and, you know, trying to find other ways to do it and think about that early on because that's often, once that's in their head of how it's going to look and feel, it's hard to get away from that. But going for passive house, it's something we really need to start thinking more about.
Excellent. Thank you for that. And I am now going to hand it to Erin to kind of help us go through some of the questions that have come in through the chat. I have been managing that. So Erin, if you would throw our panel and ICF a few of the questions.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Luke. So we actually had quite a few good questions come on through. So I'm just going to go through a few of them. And if folks listening have more questions, feel free to add them to the chat and we can kind of go through them here until we run out of time. So first off, I want to go back to energy modeling. Had a couple of questions around what you're looking for an energy model. Obviously, with a passive house, you're using WUFI or PHPP. Does this meet what Mass Save is looking for energy modeling, or are you doing something else in addition?
So
Anyone?
I'll unmute myself and let me start with that one since I saw the question. So for us to pay the incentives, we do want to get a copy of the WFI passive model or a copy of the PHPP so that we actually have the model. We'll probably ask for that a couple of times just so that we have the information. One of the things that we try to do at MassSave is try to learn and improve our program. So we look at this data and that's how we improve what we're doing. We'll probably also want modeling reports. We'll want backup data as well. But hey, we're going to give you, $20,000. So work with us. We also will be doing our own modeling. We'll do our own modeling for net performance bonus calculation. We use our own tool for that with Energy Plus as the engine. And that is just to make sure that everyone is working from an even playing field when we're calculating incentives.
Great. I think that gets at that question. Thank you. So one came up around solar in projects. And are you guys seeing any use of offsite solar to meet the requirements in addition to, on-site or renewable energy credits? And would that work? Would that be eligible for the program using offsite solar?
Yeah, we have actually one really interesting project where, most of the time we're trying to maximize the amount of on-site solar that we're doing. So we're doing really careful planning with the team around the roof area to begin with and mechanical systems to try and really maximize the amount of on-site solar that we can do. And we're trying to do those early stage helioscope studies to really identify that early and sort of lock those spaces in place as for solar. In some circumstances with some projects, as we're trying to meet our source energy requirements, we're kind of bumping up against like the amount of space that we have for solar and the kind of solar that we would need in order to do that. So we have one project right now where we really, we're actually looking at an adjacent building. And so this is a development of multiple buildings. One building is going to be certified passive house. They really could use some extra electricity generation to be able to hit their source energy requirements. And they want to do that as close to the building as possible. So they're actually looking at roof space on an adjacent building that would be dedicated to the passive house building. So that's one way where we've sort of used quote unquote offsite solar. It's not super offsite. But we're really otherwise focusing on solar that's directly contributing to the building.
Yeah, and we've had one project that was pretty much completely shaded, and they ended up going with renewable energy credits to meet that requirement, and pretty straightforward process. So
okay.
There's options.
And from the incentive perspective, we don't care, but we do need to see that the project meets the passive house criteria. And so as long as the way that the project is set up and the way any solar is being applied or purchased, that works with the third-party TS and PHI requirements. As long as that works, then that's fine with the incentive program.
Great, thank you. All right, so just a question clarifying feasibility studies and who qualifies. Is it any residential project 4 units or more, or are there more qualifications needed to get a feasibility study?
So 5 units and more for the passive house incentives, multifamily, so it does need to be a residential project with ideally contiguous envelope. So we're not looking at 5 independent buildings, each single family. They have to be actually together as a single project. But the beyond that, no height restrictions, no unit restrictions.
Yeah, the only other requirement is that we do want these projects to enroll early. Going backwards, backing into passive house once you're in design development. It's a painful, hard process. So 5 units or more, attached units, and in schematic design or maybe extremely early DD would be the requirements. Happy to talk to you about your project.
Great. All right, and for everyone on here, we'll send out the registration form after this to all attendees, the one that came up earlier in the presentation. But for Kristen or Luke, if you know, folks on here, developers want to actually start enrolling in the program, is it as simple as sending in that form? Are there other steps they should be taking for their first step?
Reaching out to multifhr@icf.com is a great way to start the conversation. We are regularly, always monitoring that email and can answer any questions and get information to any participants. It is definitely reaching out to me or Kristen is also a possibility. We will be responding to those emails at multifhr@icf.com anyway, but feel free to give me a call. I'm happy to answer any questions on Passive House incentives at any time.
Thanks. There's some questions about sort of a lot of folks going through this process for the first time of doing a passive house. Can you give an idea for those who've done these studies of what a project in terms of like a HERS score might typically meet as they approach a passive house project? What's the comparable HERS number?
So is anybody dying to answer this question? For a HERS score, it is not unusual to be in the 45, 40 range. It's challenging to get there, but that's a reasonable kind of target or area.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I would second that. You know, I think one interesting thing that we see is that you know, the modeling software that generates the HERS scores like REMRate and Ecotrope, they tend to have a sort of bias towards gas-based systems. And so we do tend to see lower HERS scores for projects that have gas-based systems than all-electric systems. So there is, you know, I've seen really sort of a 10-point range in terms of HERS scores. If you look at a building that's, for example, all-electric versus a building that has gas-fired heating and domestic hot water.
Great. Okay, thank you. There were a lot of discussions in the chat around costs and incremental costs of these projects. Some of the consensus seems to be around 2 to 5% for a multifamily building going passive house in this area. I'm kind of curious if that, in your experience, is accurate, and sort of what you're seeing around cost to achieve passive house through this program.
Yeah, I mean, I think the most developed affordable projects that we have at this point is Finch Cambridge, and that's one I know everyone on this team has spoken a lot about. I think Michelle's on the call. Yeah, it's right behind Luke.
I've been visiting.
Yeah, and so that project, actually, they've just gone through the process of really sort of sorting through the incremental cost. So that's a great example of a you know, final stage incremental cost number that we have. And, you know, I think we're talking about 1.2% hard cost, incremental cost. And when we talk about a baseline, that's a very solid stretch code baseline. So I say that sort of quote unquote solid stretch code baseline because we all know that there's lots of ways to hit stretch code compliance. And one of them is, you know, basic HERS 55. And that's not the same as doing an Energy Star certified building or some of the other compliance approaches. And so like a really solid stretch code compliant building, I think is really the baseline that they're looking at there. To get to FIAS, they're looking at a 1.2% incremental cost. That's before incentives. So when you factor in the incentives that project got, it's actually a negative 0.3% incremental cost. So that's, the most information we have at this point at the project that's the farthest along. This feasibility study phase is actually a really great phase to get some very early stage incremental cost information, because that is when developers are making decisions around this stuff. And so we very much see these studies being taken and then priced by cost estimators, for early stage pricing. And so, on almost every one of these feasibility studies, we're getting incremental cost information, because that's what the developer is making a decision using. Like, am I going to go and do this? Am I going to keep pushing this forward or not? And so we are seeing projects that are in that sort of 0 to 2 or 3% range. That's generally where things are coming through. I think there's a bit of a void between these really early stage pricing exercises where people kind of compare these things, and then the projects that are going through these passive house programs and then are required to report on incremental costs. So they're coming up with final construction phase incremental costs. I'd love to see more sort of incremental stage sort of comparisons of baselines versus the passive house approach. But the reality is, once a team decides to move into passive house, they're not very often then asking their cost estimator to say, well, can you take what we've designed and compare it to this? Or, so unfortunately, it's not as clear in that sort of design and construction document phase what the increment is. But we are seeing these sort of final phase projects and then very early stage incremental numbers, and they are falling in that range.
To kind of echo what Lauren just said, though, about this kind of space between what's being done in the early stages versus what's the information that's coming out during construction and after. And that also kind of gets to what Kristen mentioned earlier on. It is really critical that these decisions are being made in those early stage design scenarios. And unfortunately, it does lead to now kind of losing the comparison perhaps along the way, but we can always model that, and perhaps in some academic exercises kind of work our way towards what the cost comparisons would be to code and slightly beyond code buildings. But it is just an example of how it is actually very difficult to turn a building after it has gotten into the design development stage back to a passive house building or into a passive house building. It really,
that's the way to make a really expensive passive house.
Yeah.
Backward engineer into it. And I'll just add on one thing right here. I have an anecdotal story about one of our program participants. They had been working with a GC. The developer had a long experience working with a GC. GC had been involved with this one particular passive house project during design, had been pricing it during design. And the numbers kept coming high. And there was some expectation, because it's a passive house project, that it's going to be more expensive, right? I mean, I think, everyone thinks that way. But the numbers were so high that the developer said, wait a minute, let's stop. Let's put this out to bid. So they did put the project out to bid, and the bids came back so much lower than what the original GC had. There was still a slight cost increase for some of the passive house features, but it was, actually, I can tell you, the developer was telling me this and laughing. He was extremely excited. He was very happy, but going through that process of bidding it out and not just sticking with the one developer or the one contractor they'd been working with, and they pulled the trigger, and they're definitely building a passive house. So not saying that all projects should go out to bid or that, but I think that there are definitely GCs, definitely contractors and subcontractors out there who want to work on these projects, and they will sharpen their pencils when it comes to it to get them done. So that was very exciting. It's good when you hear a developer laugh about bids for their project. It's a good thing.
Great. And again, for Kristen or Luke, obviously it's pretty early in this program, but based on sort of projects going through the feasibility studies in the early stages so far, how many do you think are going to go ahead and actually become passive house buildings, become certified? How many do you think are going to go and achieve net performances bonuses beyond passive house? What are the goals here?
Well, I would like for all of the projects that enroll in as passive house, and pursue feasibility studies to actually complete as certified passive house projects. That would be awesome. But my big goal, and the big goal of the sponsors of Mass Save, is to significantly improve and increase energy efficiency. So I am extremely pleased if a project becomes a better project, but not a certified passive house project. So if that answers that question. Ultimately, we'd like to see all projects, how can I say, it would be great to have 25 or 50 certified passive house projects, but I would be so much happier if the next 250 multifamily projects being built in Massachusetts were 25% more energy efficient than they currently are. That's going to give us a bigger bang for a buck in the long run. But I'm pulling for each and every project to successfully become a passive house certified project. That's the first thing. And there was a second part of that about
I guess
bonus.
Well, just at this stage, how many projects do you have enrolled, and how many of those are hitting the benchmarks to get to passive house?
Well, so right now we've got about 50 projects enrolled. A smaller percentage of those have completed feasibility study, and even smaller percentage are in construction. It is, I think, too soon to tell what will happen. Everyone who's on this call, you're involved in development and construction. You know that projects that you think will go in construction next year might get pushed off for 2 years or so. Especially low income projects or affordable projects, the financing issues, we didn't make this cycle, we're gonna try again in 6 months. That can go on for quite a while. So I think these are numbers that we're gonna have to update pretty regularly, and we'll see what will happen. We'll see, I think a lot of this will, I don't know. I think this is a question for Lauren and Ian and Ashley, since they are working directly with developers on a regular basis. What's the appetite when you are reviewing these feasibility studies with your clients? What are their thoughts?
Yeah, I think, we've done about 10 of these at this point through the Mass Save program, 10 feasibility studies. And I would say, I would guess probably 8 of them are going to move forward. We've done one in a community where, it was a affordable housing project, low income tax credit project, stretch code community, but the developer was very used to doing extremely baseline HERS 55 stretch code development. And so it was a bigger jump for them to think about the sort of hard and soft costs associated with going from just hiring a HERS rater to come in and do a very quick and dirty energy model and do some final testing at the end of construction, to the passive house certification process and building a passive house certified building. So I think that's one where, we did the feasibility study for them, but they may choose not to push it forward. We had a market rate one where the project, because of the current pandemic and financial concerns, has decided that they're not willing to push too hard on this at this point. But those are really just the 2 examples. I would say of the other ones, people have really kind of grabbed onto this and are pursuing it aggressively and have submitted applications that commit to it. So if they get funded, they'll move forward.
Yeah, and I can just add that we have one affordable housing project that's kind of still waiting for financing approval. So that's may kick that project to next year if they don't get that next month. But most of the market rate projects so far seem like they're gung-ho to kind of move forward with passive house and complete it.
Yeah, Ian, that really aligns with what I'm hearing. I am hearing from a lot of market rate developers, especially some of the well-known names. I can't name names. I must keep things confidential. But there's a big desire on the part of a lot of developers to do the right thing. And I think they've held off in some cases, pursuing really high performance because they were concerned about costs. But with the incentives, especially the feasibility study, that's beginning to, I think the incentives are allowing them to pursue things that they've wanted to do, but have not felt that they were financially able to do. So I really hope that is the case, and we see more of that. I think definitely the affordable and low income developers are, I mean, this makes total sense if you're going to own these buildings for, for decades. So really getting the attention of the market rate developers, I think it will be really critical if we want to continue the market transformation.
If I can just add one more piece, and that is these incentives offer significant opportunities for training, not only of professionals, as we've discussed with the training incentives that are available, but for the developers, for the estimators, for the contractors. Some of that training is, of course, webinars and sessions like this, but some of that training is the process of doing. And this is really getting teams to do the work to understand Passive House. And ultimately, that's going to raise the bar for projects throughout. It might take a little while, but it is going to have an impact. It's neat to be seeing that impact really kind of hitting pretty fast, a lot of these teams.
Great. Thank you all. It's so great to hear that so many projects are starting to enroll in this already, and most of them are on track to become Passive House certified down the road, and it's tremendous to see that build. And obviously this is early on in the program, lots of success so far, but we'll be looking for updates as this goes on in the months and years to follow. So thank you, Luke, Lauren, Ashley, Ian, Kristen, for putting this together and being here. This is the time that we have, so we're up to our time. As I said, I'll send out a follow-up email to all participants here with some of the documents they were referencing. Feel free to reply with any questions. We can continue the conversation. We'll have another Passive House Massachusetts meeting just like this on the second Tuesday of July. More information on that to follow. Go to our website to find out about all those other events and trainings that I mentioned, including the heat pump workshop on Thursday. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Take care.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.